Greetings, friends of liberty. I would note here, by way of introduction, that we English have no end of extraordinary Englishmen called Murray. First, my dear friend, the first Earl of Mansfield, William Murray, Chief Justice of all of England, noted and celebrated for his landmark decision confirming that English law allows no slaves to be held on this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty. Secondly, James Murray, the Scottish general, who was governor of the province of Quebec, championed religious tolerance even for papists, his tolerant policies being enacted into law in the Quebec Act of 1774. And finally, that noted grammarian and linguist Lindley Murray, the memory of whose accomplishments, however, and work on behalf of the English language have now unfortunately languished and passed into almost complete abeyance. However, if we turn to your 21st century, I'm proud to say that we also find the outstanding Englishman Douglas Murray, an acclaimed journalist and author who, again in this book, The War on the West, examines the increasingly irrational ideologies confronting the West. As he did in his last book, The Madness of Crowds, when he focused on four main subjects, gay, women, race, and trans, in this book he breaks his treatment down into race, history, religion, and culture. And just as in his last book, when he inserted 3 interludes or breaks between each of the 4 main chapters, he does that here as well. These interludes being China, reparations, and gratitude. Let's cycle by way of review through each of his 4 major sections. Section number 1, race. Douglas begins by noting that although the war referenced in his title is not a war of armored columns breaking through enemy lines in blitzkrieg fashion, nor one involving a strategic bombing campaign with squadrons of B-24s and 17s, it is nonetheless as a culture war just as potentially deadly in its own way, in attacking the very psychological and ethical nature of the West. Common now are direct attacks on Western civilization, from Jesse Jackson 3 decades ago, attacking Stanford's famous course on Western Civ, long since discontinued, to modern critics such as the learned fools Noam Chomsky and Naomi Klein, adding their own tirades on the alleged evils of capitalism and freedom. Douglas immediately reveals some of the obvious biases of the left, as when, for example, he writes, gays were celebrated so long as they were queer and wanted to pull down all existing institutions, but gays who just wanted to get on with life or who actually liked the Western world were sidelined. Similarly, so long as feminists were attacking male structures, Western capitalism, and much more, they were useful. But feminists who didn't toe that line or thought they were comparatively well off in the West were treated as sellouts at best, enemies at worst. He argues interestingly that since white people often represent Western virtues, for this reason, derivatively, they too have come increasingly under attack, first by Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, famous originators of CRT theory, and then by their heirs apparent, Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. That famously scruffy, baseball hat-wearing liberal, Michael Moore, wrote Stupid White Men, and even Jimmy Fallon received rounds of applause when on his late-night show he mentioned that a recent census had shown a decline in the number of white people. Imagine the horror of the general public if one had announced that there were fewer Native Americans or blacks in America. Because of the spread of this hysterical anti-white ideology, people in general believe the oddest things, such as, at numerous campuses throughout America, that Klansmen were searching for blacks to lynch, or that nooses are hanging everywhere in neighborhoods and NASCAR garages, as Bubba Wallace famously alleged. And this hysteria is to be expected since that's the purpose of ideologies, to spread ignorance and with them fear. And so, for example, as Douglas says, 22% of people who identified as very liberal and said that they thought the police shot at least 10,000 unarmed black men in a year. The actual number? About 10. In fact, more police officers were killed by black Americans than unarmed black Americans were killed by the police. Ironically, the deaths of unarmed whites who were unjustly killed by the police, such as Tony Timpa in Dallas, are ignored and trivialized, and their police murderers left free to kill again, unlike the case of George Floyd. Dare I ask, do white deaths matter? Douglas's frequent lighthearted touch works well in this regard, as when discussing BLM and a Seattle Whole Foods, he says, "It had a vast banner hanging at the front. In huge letters as big as the shop's name, it declared, 'Racism has no place here.' As though the fruit and nuts aisle of the Whole Foods in Seattle had been a known gathering place for the Klan." And in another spot, he mentions how if you tour Portland, since so many statues have been pulled down, you'll see a wide variety of empty plinths. In his second major section, History, he starts by examining the American Advanced Placement History exam given in 2021 to high school seniors, and found that out of 48 questions, 8 dealt exclusively with racial issues, another 4 with related racial issues, and another 4 with economic matters from a Marxist critique of capitalism. At least some of this skewed emphasis can be attributed to the influence of Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 Project, which famously attempted to argue that the real purpose of the colony at Jamestown was to essentially set up a slave state. And the purpose of the revolution was because the colonists wanted to protect the institution of slavery. As he continues, Douglas again reveals the methods of these anti-Western attacks. Number 1, how those pulling down or attacking statues of Confederates in the South quickly proceeded to the likes of George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and Abraham Lincoln, all of whom, of course, opposed slavery. Number 2, he discusses how after Cecil B. Rhodes, whose statue in South Africa was taken down, woke activists in England continued the attack on his Oxford statue, in the attempt smearing Mr. Rhodes by attributing 3 vile quotations to him, one using the N-word that he had never said. Number 3, he notes the contradiction pointed out by Thomas Sowell and many others, how the Islamic slave trade from Africa to the Middle East, which actually killed about the same number of slaves as the Atlantic slave trade, is hardly ever condemned. Number 4, he points out that the Portuguese and Spanish colonies of Brazil, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, as well as Saudi Arabia and the Ottoman Empire, imported many more slaves than the Anglosphere, but how no one from the Kendi crowd breathes a word of this, nor of the many African countries that continue to enslave Africans. Number 5, concerning the efforts of the Royal Navy to destroy the slave trade, he says, between 1808 and 1860, the West Africa Squadron captured 1,600 slave ships and freed 150,000 African slaves. They also lost a huge number of personnel themselves. More than 1,500 men of the Royal Navy were killed in action during this period. Number 6, he details the long and fervent campaign to smear the memory of Winston Churchill. And as, for example, when Noam Chomsky claimed that Churchill advocated gassing civilians, Chomsky conveniently admitting that Churchill had meant using not chlorine or mustard gas, but tear gas for crowd control. And finally, number 7, he points out the very blatant contradiction that modern BLM and woke activists never try to tear down statues of Marx, Engels, or other thinkers from the left, despite the fact that many of these can be shown to have made racist comments, with Karl Marx at least twice using the N-word or talking about the good side of slavery. And finally, number 8, Douglas explains that you won't hear from modern postmodernists that their hero, Michel Foucault, when he was in Tunis, North Africa, regularly paid for and engaged in sex on local cemetery gravestones with children. No, that you won't hear. As Douglas says, one of the many oddities of these revelations is that, to date, they seem to have done nothing to dent Foucault's reputation. Let's move now to Douglas's third section, religion. He begins by noticing how participation in church services in the West has dropped, saying, in the United Kingdom, church attendance fell by more than half in the last 40 years, while the number of Americans who identified themselves as Christians fell by over 12% in the last decade alone. Douglas immediately quotes and agrees with liberal linguist John McWhorter, who believes that woke racism is a new form of religion. McWhorter is saying, it has an original sin, white privilege, it has a judgment day, coming to terms with race, and it has the excommunication of the heretic, social media shamings, and more. The problem with this belief, as I explained in my review of John's book, Woke Racism, is that there is no element of the supernatural which exists in all religions. We could just as easily make any number of similar analogies to secular ideologies like communism, which also has an original sin, being capitalist or bourgeois, having a judgment day, which is the world revolution overthrowing capitalism, and having inquisitions of heretics, which are gulags and slave labor camps. So again, as I said in my review, what John is doing is comparing two things which are similar, but not the same. In other words, confusing cats with dogs. Under his treatment of religion, Douglas also includes philosophy, and so covers the very stringent way in which modern woke critics look for any tiny phrase in Kant or Aristotle or Voltaire that might allow them to dismiss these thinkers without grappling seriously with their ideas. So, for example, Kant may have made a couple of pro-slavery remarks, and in the first book of his Politics, Aristotle stands charged with having used taxonomies to justify the exclusion of certain people from civic life. A truly shocking fact in a work written around the year 300 BC. In the same way, Voltaire is lambasted for having made one racist remark in all of his voluminous writings. As Douglas says, this ignores entirely his devastating attacks on the immorality of slavery, not least in Candide. So out goes Voltaire, his 1763 treatise on tolerance, and all the rest of it. In Douglas's fourth and final section, Culture, he begins by describing the brilliant 1927 triumph of the enormously talented English painter Rex Whistler for a painting called Expedition in the Pursuit of Rare Meats, a fantasy, whose completion had required 18 months, Whistler working night and day covering the walls in the basement restaurant of the Tate Gallery in London. Not only were these paintings subsequently beloved by the public for their fantastic breadth of imagination and technical skill, but when the Thames River flooded in January of 1928, its floodwaters entering the building and half submerging his paintings, Whistler returned to his damaged creations, saying, well, at least the mermaids came into their own, and repainted the whole work, restoring it to its full vitality. Of course, leave it to the modern haters of Western civilization in 2018 to have pretended to have found something wrong with it. First, a couple of images of young black slaves being pulled either by a neck chain or by a rope on his hands by female white mistresses, and another of a few Chinese. That was enough out of the whole room full of hundreds of figures. And so the Tate Gallery, after a period of about 2 years of rumination and increasing cowardlessness, completely disavowed the painting and closed the restaurant. Forget the fact that Rex Whistler gave his life in 1944 fighting the Nazis in France. Forget that the London Times, when publishing his obituary, received a record amount of letters by readers lamenting the death of this extraordinary young man, and forget that he was a friendly man who effortlessly charmed all who met him. Just cancel his masterpiece. Douglas concludes this section by noting additional evidence of woke hostility to artists or the arts. Number one, that now allegedly Shakespeare's works are full of problematic, outdated ideas with plenty of misogyny, racism, homophobia, classism, anti-Semitism, and misogynoir, which is like misogyny except against black women. Number two, that although the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge had expressed anti-slavery views himself and recorded these views in his poetry, he was on the blacklist nonetheless because he was recorded as having a nephew who lived in Barbados where there were slaves. Number three, even the famous botanical Kew Gardens, unjustly feeling embarrassed by their colonial past, put out a statement saying that they hope people do not feel intimidated by the Victorian wrought iron gates of Kew. And four, Douglas notes how blind musical auditions for orchestras, which are the standard in fairness for judging musical ability, are now being attacked by the woke because, as a result, not enough minorities make the classical grade. So now, having seen the book's many strengths, let's ask, does it have any weaknesses? Let's imagine that we had a superb journalist like Douglas 100 years ago, sitting on a hillside on the island of Bali, watching a huge tsunami approaching a town below him. That journalist might describe the impact of the tsunami and its horrendous aftermath in great and moving detail, without, however, knowing or having any real understanding of why the tsunami appeared. Now, Douglas in this book wants to do more than just describe what's happening. As he says at one point, this leads us to a second, deeper puzzle. Why open everything in the West to assault? But in attempting to answer this question, he completely fails, because we might say he's missing two tools from his intellectual toolkit. The first of which is a broadly economic approach to the problem. So what do I mean by that? Free market economists understand the important concept of unintended consequences to rights-violating laws. So a simple example here would be minimum wage laws, which attempt to force employers to pay a higher wage than they otherwise would in a free market to employees whose work is not worth the minimum wage. And so the result, the unintended consequence, is that instead of these workers getting a higher wage as politicians would like, they instead remain unemployed because no employer wants to lose money by hiring them. And so what Douglas doesn't see is that the emergence of the woke ideology gradually after World War II, first with political correctness in the 1990s and then increasingly now with wokeness, is an unintended consequence of bad rights-violating laws. That's the first thing he missed. The second is having a basic conception of how the institutions of a nation can become corrupted. And a good analogy to use here is that of a sports team. Let's say an American football team. So the positions on an American football team can be compared to the institutions of a society. Just as they have a center, guards, tackles, ends, running backs, and a quarterback on the football team, so too societies have their varied institutions: scientific, educational, charitable, philanthropic, commercial, financial, governmental, and artistic. And so, just as in a sports team, when a player doesn't do his job well, the whole team can suffer. So too, if the single institutions of a society become corruptive and ineffective, the whole society can suffer. A typical example here would be the Great Depression in the United States, which was caused by the Federal Reserve inflating the money supply during the whole Roaring '20s, starting the Depression. Additionally, Franklin Roosevelt, instead of letting the Depression play itself out as Calvin Coolidge had with the Depression of 1921, which no one remembers, by letting prices correct, by lowering themselves, instead he manipulated prices, trying to keep them high and thus delaying recovery by 6 to 8 years. So when FDR famously said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," that was 100% wrong. What Americans had to fear was this economic ignoramus who prolonged this horrendous depression by many years. So, one set of institutions, here the Federal Reserve and the presidency, affected in the case of the Great Depression, not just the whole nation, but to a degree, the whole world. So what Douglas doesn't see with regard to the rise of anti-Western wokeness is that the present crisis is essentially caused in the U.S. by one team player, the educational institutions, becoming corrupted by bad ideologies, and spreading these not just throughout the U.S., but through the whole Anglosphere as well. And this is an unintended consequence of the fact that colleges and universities in the U.S. have been intellectually corrupted increasingly since World War II by their enormously increased governmental funding and control, which has, allowed these ideologies to gain a foothold and then spread to the wider society. In addition, there have been the indirect consequences of the affirmative action of civil rights law in the U.S., which, through their coercive court-imposed quotas and the necessity to adhere to these quotas to receive that enormous stream of governmental funding, have forced colleges to become operationally and functionally woke or go bankrupt. So this legally imposed racial vision, where all races are proportionally represented in all circumstances, imposed by civil rights bureaucracies like the Office of Civil Rights or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has given woke ideology a legal backing, imposing its racist criteria on educational, business, and governmental institutions. Finally, note that all the educational systems in the Anglosphere, in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, in England, and the US are largely funded by government now, and also have their own affirmative action and civil rights laws regulating them, which they didn't before. Nonetheless, this theoretical weakness aside, which is not directly germane, since Douglas is a journalist and not an economist or political scientist, I would give this book a B+, given that his superb and detailed coverage throughout and his oft-demonstrated and penetrating ability to consistently reveal the numerous hypocrisies and inconsistencies in woke critics and thinkers. On that note of hope and possibility, that if a few prominent journalists and thinkers like Douglas Murray could finally understand the nature and origin of the rise of wokeness, we could begin to make significant progress in fighting it and destroying it. I bid you all well, and remain as ever, the Scarlet Pimpernel.